sound that people in Israel woke up to this morning as sirens wailed. Iran had launched strikes on Israel in retaliation, it said, for Israeli hits on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. As its citizens headed to emergency shelters, Israel offered a reprisal of its own, hitting several cities in southern Iran. It was the most serious crossfire since an April 8 ceasefire was reached, a ceasefire that was always shaky at best. Israel's reprisal happened despite a request from the US White House to stand down. And it's a warm welcome to DW's live stream as we take in the latest on the first exchange of fire between Israel and Iran since a ceasefire came into place 2 months ago. We are live on YouTube, where I can see plenty of people joining in the chat and joining us from all over the world. We'll be taking your questions along the way. A shout out to those joining us on TikTok as well. I'll be monitoring both chats as we go. As a starting point, I'd like to know where in the world you might be watching us. Big hello from Berlin. Where you're watching and what do you see and feel as you digest this news and this developing situation? Missiles fired in both directions between Iran and Israel. Coming up in this live show, we've got an Iranian expert, Siavush Randjbar-Daemi, who has got a really deep knowledge of Iran. So many questions for him about how this plays out from the Iranian perspective. If they are a weakened regime, then what is their next move? We'll hear a bit from officials on both sides, naturally. And right in the middle, I want to take you to a live look at how the markets are greeting the news of a breach in this ceasefire. A quick look now, if we can, will give you the idea of how this is going down. This is the start of the trading today on news of rockets being fired in both directions. That sharp jump, that is the day's trading. It's been volatile, obviously, since the start of this conflict. We can see the start there, and if you go back, we have a historical perspective, I guess. That's the year, and the only time we've seen anything like that is, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Very similar levels. We'll be keeping an eye on the daily trading rates as we go along, and obviously the price of oil has jumped pretty sharply, and we'll keep an eye on that. You get the idea. This is going to be a busy time as we talk to you about what we know and what has come to light, and try and predict where this is going to go next. As a starting point, let's bring in Middle East correspondent Emily Gordine. Emily, good to see you. I'd like to know how the people in Israel are reacting to this renewed exchange of fire, taking shelter, schools closed, etc. What's the reaction been?
Well, the atmosphere in Israel is tense, but at the same time, sadly, it has to be said that Israelis are very much have a routine when it comes to these kind of threats. They are very much used to following the advice from the Home Front Command. They seek out shelters. Many Israelis also prep the shelters in advance for any kind of eventualities. But of course, yes, schools have been closed nationwide. Hospitals have also been ordered to move their operations underground, and the atmosphere is, all in all, quite tense because nobody knows whether this is going to lead to a wider war again with Iran, or whether this is just another tit for tat and then it will calm down again.
All right, Emily, let's make sure we get some context just to understand this complex and somewhat confusing conflict a little better if we can. Let's take a look now at some of the key events from the last few months, if we could, a timeline of sorts. The United States, and Israel attack Iran. February 28th, onward to March the 2nd, Hezbollah enters the war by firing rockets at Israel. Israel retaliates on that occasion. Further to April 7th, a ceasefire is announced with talks to continue. Israel is not included in them. April 8th, Israel bombards Lebanon's capital, Beirut. And as it unfolds further, April 14th, Lebanon and Israel hold diplomatic talks in Washington. And to April 17th, an Israel-Lebanon ceasefire is implemented without Hezbollah, that being crucial. The fighting soon resumes. Onward to June 3rd, Israel and Lebanon renew their ceasefire, which of course brings us further onward to June 4th. Hezbollah rejects the ceasefire and demands Israel withdraw from Lebanon. On to June 5, Iran's Revolutionary Guard say no calm in the region if Israel doesn't withdraw. And to June 7th, Hezbollah fires at Israel, where we are now. Israel strikes Beirut's southern suburbs and Iran fires at Israel. Israel launching an airstrike on Iran is the latest that we have. Emily, is this shaky ceasefire? What's the feeling there? Is this seen as the end of the ceasefire or more hopefully a brief departure from the relative peace between Iran and Israel?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, many Israelis, when it comes to Iran, what they wanted to see is Iran's nuclear program dismantled, as well as its ballistic missile program dismantled. Now, when you look at what's been coming out of the talks between these indirect talks between Iran and the US, those two key issues had not been addressed, and that is, of course, of concern for the Israelis who see Iran as an existential threat to their security. And so from that starting point, many Israelis had been eyeing a further confrontation down the line. The Times of Israel headline today talking about, a smouldering war, a war that hadn't really been put to rest, but that was sort of lingering in the background. So I think many Israelis knew that there was more to come. The question is, to what end? And will the Israelis, in effect, achieve their goals when it comes to this war with Iran?
All right. Emily, here's just quickly how Israel's military has justified the fresh strikes against targets across Iran.
The Iranian terrorist regime made a grave mistake when it once again chose terrorism. The regime is trying to create a new equation by carrying out a direct attack against us in response to IDF strikes in Da'ieh. We will not allow this. We attacked in the Da'ieh following Hezbollah's unceasing fire toward our communities in the north. The IDF will continue to operate throughout Lebanon and will deepen the damage to the Hezbollah terrorist organization. We will not allow continued fire toward the citizens of the State of Israel.
Emily, back with you. It does sound like Israel is not planning to scale back its offensive in Lebanon despite the attacks coming from Tehran. What has Benjamin Netanyahu said in terms of what comes next?
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu is looking at the elections this year in Israel, and he has to essentially, he is using this war well, that's at least what many observers are saying, to garner votes here. And he knows that he needs to be able to reach a certain situation with Iran to be able to sell this as a win to his voter base. And now Netanyahu himself he was the one, together with Defense Minister Israel Katz, who went ahead with these strikes on the Dahiya neighborhoods in Beirut, despite earlier warnings from the Iranian regime that this would lead to an Iranian involvement in the conflict. And Netanyahu has also continued to say that it acts in accordance with what is necessary for the protection of the State of Israel. And we're also hearing from the Israeli authorities that they are, in fact, coordinating the attacks on Iran with the Americans, and that they expect the attacks to last a few days.
Emily, before we let you go, this is still a developing situation. We'll take a look at the oil markets again live shortly, and some audience questions from around the world. But what about where you are and how Israelis are feeling about the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, having laid out his case, as you say, and his role particularly in these latest strikes in Iran? How's he been seen in Israel?
Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is an incredibly divisive figure, not least because many see him as partly responsible for allowing October 7th, the attacks by Hamas on Israel in 2023, to happen. But what is quite curious about Israel in that regard is that when you look at the opposition in Israel, they're actually promoting an even tougher stance, not just on Iran, but also on Lebanon. And they're saying that, Naftali Bennett this morning was tweeting that this is the moment where where Netanyahu has to show the world and Israel that it is an independent state, that it is a sovereign state, that it can act without the Americans, essentially. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the same time knows that militarily they need the assistance of the Americans, they need the support, and also the international political backing is very important. But there you see that even though Netanyahu is a very divisive figure, many in the opposition in Israel want to see an even tougher stance on these wars that Israel is still waging in Lebanon and now with Iran. So he is under a lot of pressure in Israel to keep going to fulfill the promises that he ultimately made when it comes to Iran, dismantling the nuclear and ballistic missile program, and when it comes to Lebanon, dismantling Hezbollah so that it does not pose a threat anymore to the communities in the north of Israel. None of these goals have, as of yet, been achieved.
DW's Middle East correspondent Emily Gordine, it's great to chat. We'll leave it there for now. Thanks so much. All right, let's get back to checking what we've been monitoring since the start of our broadcast. And since the start of the day, very much, it's the oil prices that have continued to climb after Iran fired missiles at each other, Iran and Israel, for the first time since the ceasefire was agreed upon between the two sides in April. The start of the day around that $90 mark and that sharp bump straight up on the opening of trading there, up to about 94, 95. So we have seen that before over the course of this war. That's how markets reacted in real time this morning. You can see that all that volatility starting with the start of this conflict in the Gulf. And of course, looking back over a year, you get that better idea of prices up around 30% since the start of the war to where they were in the 9 months before that. The last time we saw anything like these prices is, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If we go back to February 21 of 2022, there we are there in the crosshairs, right on the verge of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So historically there is a precedent, but we are very much in the upper reaches of where we've been anywhere in the last 10 years. All right. We're going to move on because we have another guest standing by. We want to take things and get the Iranian perspective. And welcome in Dr. Siavush Randjbar-Daemi, a senior lecturer in modern Middle Eastern history at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Welcome to you. I want to know how much hope that you have that this latest exchange of missile fire between Israel and Iran will be a limited event and not a return to a daily or nightly exchanges?
Well, it could be something along the lines of last year's war that lasted 12 days. So I think both sides are digging in for something which will go beyond the skirmish level, if you want, because we have to bear in mind that neither Israel was not part of the diplomatic initiative which started after that ceasefire was achieved in April. Animosity between Iran and Israel has continued. The two sides are far apart when it comes to Lebanon and how that could be included in the deal between Iran and the United States. And of course, whether defiantly or with some tacit agreement, it appears that Israel has flouted Trump's preference for a lack of retaliation to the initial Iranian missile strikes of last night. So this doesn't really look like something which will come to a head in the next few hours unless, again, the United States applies a considerable amount of pressure on both sides, particularly Israel, and brings this to a swift end.
Siavush, I want to get the thoughts from the Iranian military in a second, and also pay attention to the chat a little bit from Israel. Jonathan saying he had 2 sirens there this morning from President General. We'd like the United States of America to be a little patient at this point. We're looking forward to peace missions between Iran and Israel. Hakim's making the point, in his opinion, that Israel has never respected any ceasefire. So the chat is definitely livening up. I want to now take it to Iran. Here's how the state news media in Iran are framing the latest attacks. The first exchange of live fire, direct fire between Israel and Iran for 2 months since the ceasefire. This is a news anchor in Tehran, Siavush, quoting the Revolutionary Guard. Please stay with us.
Our acceptance of the ceasefire on April 8th was conditional upon the stopping of hostilities on all fronts. But as always, the United States and the Zionist regime failed to uphold their commitments. They continued their aggression and crimes in Lebanon and repeatedly violated the ceasefire through attacks on Iranian coasts and vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, and the Indian Ocean. Tonight's operation was a warning. Should these acts of aggression be repeated, the responses will be broader in scope and will encompass all American and Zionist targets throughout the region.
Dr. Siavush Randjbar-Daemi is still with me, Senior Lecturer in Modern Middle Eastern History at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Siavush, pretty clearly we have a problem keeping the peace between Israel and Iran, as there is this third player in the cycle, being Hezbollah, who are regarded as a terror organisation by US and Germany. What's the way forward when Hezbollah are involved here and Israel is attacking Lebanon and Iran, completing this circle of attacks because Israel is attacking Lebanon? Where do we go from here?
Well, it's a very complicated situation. Let's not forget that straight after those missile attacks, senior Iranian officials such as the Foreign Minister Araghchi posted on social media the flags of Iran and Lebanon, stated that this round of attacks, as opposed to previous ones, was in solidarity with Lebanon. It wasn't due to an Israeli attack on whether, the Iranian embassy in Damascus or targets inside Iran. The problem there is that, of course, Lebanon has a government and a president, and both the president recently in the media and the government have repeatedly stated that they don't want this level of relationship between Hezbollah and Iran to continue. They've asked for, they've actually approved the disarmament of Hezbollah, although they're not powerful enough to do it themselves. They're negotiating with Israel. But here you have Iran sidestepping all of this effectively. Hezbollah claiming that the negotiations between Israel and Lebanon, which are carrying on in Washington, D.C. at the ambassadorial level, is not recognized by them. So this leaves the Lebanese government in a very fraught situation where it is basically facing a bombing campaign over its own territory. This fact that it has actively issued some very important, I would say, orders to prevent it. And then you have Iran that is expressing solidarity with Lebanon, but clearly it's not really expressing solidarity or is in tandem with the Lebanese government. And Hezbollah is defying everything and just going along its own path.
A question from YouTube as we go along here, Siavush, from Tommy. Is Israel the biggest hurdle to lasting peace in the Middle East?
Well, it was not part of the ceasefire. We have to be very careful about this. So we talk about the first exchange since the ceasefire. We talk about the ceasefire in April the 8th. That was a ceasefire which was brokered by Pakistan, a country which, remember, is rather in a state of rather persistent enmity, although not of the military kind, against Israel, between Iran and the United States. And the only round of in-person negotiations we had were these Islamabad talks again between Iran and the United States. Israel never endorsed that. It held back fire because basically Trump ordered it to do so. The animosity didn't go down. And as your correspondent was saying, the activities of border and its and the Israeli incursion into southern Lebanon, all of this flies straight into the face of whatever the ceasefire achieves to do. Yeah. And it is quite telling again that the fact that it appears that Trump ordered Israel to stand back because that initial Iranian barrage of missiles did not really hit any sensitive targets or cause any substantial damage in Israel. What Israel is doing now is orders of magnitude more important. We heard about the petrochemical industry being hit this morning, for example, in Iran. That's far higher of a target than anything Iran has struck so far through its own missiles.
But you talked about the spectre of Donald Trump in this engagement. Donald Trump openly admitted to calling Benjamin Netanyahu, in his words, crazy for his continued strikes on Lebanon, bringing very much into sharp view the fact he could not influence the Israeli Prime Minister. Is Donald Trump losing power and losing influence in this conflict?
Well, we know what Donald Trump is aiming. I mean, his relationship with Israel, we know in fits and starts by way of course, the media leaks about this very fraught conversation we had. He keeps saying that the deal is very close with Iran, something that Iranians keep denying. And Iranians keep insisting on aspects which Trump denies. For example, this idea of unfreezing a considerable amount of assets, anything between $12 to $24 billion held abroad, Iranian assets held abroad before the negotiations actually get to any sensitive matter. So there's a big disconnect between what Trump says and claims in terms of what's going on and the actual picture on the ground. But let's not forget what your correspondent was saying as well. Netanyahu is in a difficult domestic situation as well. We shouldn't forget that this is not the Netanyahu government policy. I think all the people who have a reasonable chance at becoming Israeli prime minister in the elections later on today, have similar, if not more radical positions when it comes to Hezbollah and Iran. So this is a very deeply rooted enmity. And unfortunately, there isn't even a diplomatic track or hope of a diplomatic process which can bring some form of closure and some form of change in direction to the pattern we are seeing with regards to Iran and Israel, even before the June 2025 war. This is really a very deeply rooted ideological and visceral, I would say, enmity, which apparently Trump is unwilling or unable to really stem in some way and control.
While that's going on, Iran's allies in Yemen, the Houthis, have also re-entered the discussion as such, further to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Here is what, just stand by, we're going to hear from Houthis' military spokesperson and what he has had to say.
The Yemeni armed forces affirm the following. First, we declare a complete and total ban on Israeli maritime navigation in the Red Sea. And we consider all enemy movements to be legitimate military targets for our armed forces from the moment this statement is issued. Second, we affirm that we will respond to escalation with escalation, and our military operations will intensify in accordance with events and the course of the battle.
So the Houthis saying, Siavush, that they have themselves launched strikes and Israeli ships are not welcome in the Red Sea. The pressure on the US and Israel is growing in the region. Do you feel it that way?
Well, I mean, it's very asymmetric. It is true that Houthis are shooting missiles into Israel. Iran has shot dozens of missiles since last night. Of the reaction is on another magnitude. So far, we haven't had reports of substantial damage in Israel due to the Iranian missile strikes. Of course, a few will get through and they might hit sensitive targets, but we haven't seen so far. Israel is doing far more damage, I would say, with its own strikes. The petrochemical plant, important and sensitive military installations in Tehran and other cities. The retaliation that Iran has is elsewhere. The Houthis, of course, can disrupt shipping around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Iran is doing it in the Strait of Hormuz. The impact this has on Israel, however, really needs to be seen, because it doesn't seem that the whole situation around the Strait of Hormuz has tamed the Israeli aggression into Lebanon, has not tamed the Israeli reaction to the Iranian missile strikes. And quite clearly, for some time, probably the Israeli shipping is avoiding the Bab el-Mandeb completely and focusing on the Mediterranean Sea. And the problem here is that Israel has also inoculated itself from many of these major flashpoints and chokeholds that Iran can leverage on. So the impact is indirect, if you want. It's all about Iran influencing and disrupting flows of states that are closer to Israel, such as the United Arab Emirates or the United States itself and European countries, and hope that their pressure will bring about change in Israel. But in terms of direct impact of these measures on Israel, that's little. And as I said, there's this very substantial asymmetry between the sort of strikes that Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran itself are launching and targeting against Israel, despite the fact that, of course, disrupts daily life in Israel, as it does.
Siavush, I want to ask you a couple more questions. I'll just take some comments as we go along the way here from YouTube. Fontermines, Trump gets angry if you call it a war. And also from TikTok, if you want to talk about crimes, how about the citizens Iran executes for protesting in Iran? What about Iran, Siavush, and their ability to fund their regime and this war and the country at this point? That's another topic coming up in the chat. They are losing enormous amounts of revenue as they can only ship a fraction of their usual oil exports. Do you see any signs that Iran is starting to buckle financially?
Well, the economic crisis is accentuated in Iran based on statistics released rather regularly by Iranian government bodies. It is affecting citizen welfare in a very substantial manner. We have statistics such as a 50% drop in the consumption of red meat, for example. Chickens now costing as much, a single whole chicken costing as much as a tenth of the salary of a pensioner, of the ordinary state pension salary, and much else. So the Iranian government is not denying it. And at the moment, it doesn't have really a fix to this spiraling inflation. Strikes on the petrochemical industry could really affect a considerable amount of civilian life in Iran because of the way in which plastics and much else are produced. However, Iran at the same time is not Cuba and is not Hamas or Hezbollah. This is important to note. So it's not Cuba in the sense that it has its own sources of fuel. So it doesn't really risk running out of energy in the dramatic way we've seen Cuba, for example, end up, for example. It is not Hamas and Hezbollah in that it might fight like an insurgent, but of course it is a state system which has had access to, in one way or the other, to billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in oil revenue in the past couple of decades. And clearly, some of that has been stockpiled for this sort of war situation. So while the general population will go through hardships, while the extended repression is carrying on, there's been a steady stream of politically related executions by the Iranian judiciary since the ceasefire. It will just rely on mobilizing a core amount of support within society, which could be 20% or less of the general population. And of course, at least persuade the rest in not descending into the streets for economic rights, like the ones we saw in January 26, because everybody is mindful of the kind of reaction that the authorities could have, very heavy-handed, as we saw in January 2026. So for these reasons, at least in the short term, it is capable, but I don't think that it has a mid to long-term plan on how to face this persistent blockade, economic isolation, and spiraling prices. I think that's what really persuaded part of the leadership to agree to these talks and to agree to go with the diplomatic flow that Pakistan, of course, initiated in April. That was the primary reason.
Yeah. On the question of markets, Wolfine on YouTube says the American president is playing the markets. I want to ask you one more before we go, Siavush. That is also occurring here in chat is, do you get the feeling that Iran is increasingly confident that they are going to survive this encounter with a heavily armed neighbour and a superpower like the United States?
Well, they're going to survive it because, remember, this is not a conventional. It's not like Iraq in 2003. There's no land invasion, no conquest of territory. It's a very aerial war and one fought around the Persian Gulf. Iran is a very vast country. So clearly the government has physical control over large Iranian cities and the government and extends its sovereignty, at least on land, to the borders and all those elements which clearly prevent a military collapse. However, this economic problem has to be solved in one way or the other. Iran cannot just descend into triple-digit inflation and severe hardship for something like the large majority of the population, maybe 70 or 80%, that are not shielded by being within sort of the system and being the supporters that, for example, you see in these nightly rallies and videos. It has to go back to having full access to its ports in the Persian Gulf, which it doesn't now because of the blockade. So in the middle long term, something will have to change. But notwithstanding this, the main conundrum here is, even if a deal is reached between Iran and the US, what does that do in terms of the Iran-Israel relationship? Unless, again, Lebanon is solved in one way or the other, either the Lebanese government has the upper hand or Hezbollah steps back and Israel steps back and withdraws. But these are very complex issues. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to see a silver lining, a comprehensive silver lining for the Iranians at the moment. They really stand to lose from all of this.
Dr. Siavush Randjbar-Daemi, it's been an absolute pleasure. Senior lecturer in modern Middle Eastern history at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. We thank you so much for your time and wish you a good day.
You're welcome. A pleasure.
All right, that's where we're going to leave it for now. up-to-the-minute look at how the first exchange of missile fire between Iran and Israel for 2 months since the ceasefire. Big thanks to our audience on YouTube. Hope we got to enough of your questions as they came in. Likewise on TikTok. The comments and the questions really helped us shape where we took this coverage today. For now, I'll say thanks to our team here in Berlin. On behalf of them, Anthony Howard saying bye for now.